Hello and welcome back. We will start with module 2 today. In module 2, we will be focusing on language and its various variations. Variations as in language having different kinds of manifestations depending on various factors. So, in this module we will look at those variations that are speaker based variations. Speaker based variations as in the way depending on the identity of the speakers, the languages may have, any language for that matter, may have different kinds of forms. Their older term for this was dialect. So, we will start with dialect and language and dialect variations, and eventually we will look at how the terminology changed, how the methodology changed and where we are today, and then we will start our discussion with respect to the various kinds of speaker based or speaker user based variations. So, the learning objectives in this module or some sort of a roadmap, let us say, we will be examining the variations that occur within a language based on the characteristics of the speaker, various like their background, identity, social position, many other kinds of factors, variables that sometimes they are not, all of them are not universal, some of them are specific to certain cultures. So, maybe gender, maybe class, all those factors will be discussed. And this is within a language. So, we will be looking at one language and based on various of these number of factors, how within one language you can have a number of possible forms, outcomes, right. So, primarily we will be focusing on monolingual in the monolingual language communities first. Later on in the later part of the course, maybe we will look at a little bit about the bilingual communities as well. So, here we will be focusing on only one language, monolingual scenario. So, the reason why we are focusing on speaker based identity, speaker based language variation in this module is because language is often an indicator of identity. So, we mark our identity, we mark our affiliations, social belonging, all of that through language, and hence it becomes an important part of our being itself. So, our part in the society, our part in the larger community and so on. So, that is why we will start with this, because in module 1 we have looked at the introductory ideas, the historical aspects of the theories and all of that. So, the key points, the key parts of the course, we are starting with the speaker based variable. And the key variables within this of course are social status, gender, age, ethnicity, individual and the types of social networks. As I said, all of these might not be relevant in all communities, whichever is available wherever, whichever is relevant wherever, we will be trying to give you some adequate example of those scenarios. But largely these are the factors we will be looking at. So, because of and another factor here, we must remember that one individual might have membership of various social groups. So, ethnicity wise one group, class wise one group, and gender and so many things. This is not a very clear cut watertight compartments. This is a nuanced domain. Sometimes one person might belong to more than one, and sometimes those groups might be in conflict with one another. So many things are possible, but here the idea is to give you a broad overview. So, any of these factors may be relevant in accounting for where a particular change starts or how it spreads, because language for language to have a number of variables, variations, you need to have a change somewhere. So, these are the places where we will be locating our points of departure. So, this is the background within which we will go ahead with this module. So, lecture 1 today we will start with lecture 1. In lecture 1 we will be focusing on the background information, as in what is language, what is dialect, historically how did these terms come into being, what are the changes and what are the factors that decide what is a dialect and what is a language and so on. So, that the baseline, the theoretical positions and the baselines in this domain are clear. After that we will move on with the data part, data as in the social variations with respect to all the factors that we talked about. So, first thing first, what do the terms language and dialect mean? Language, I have put it with an alternative of variation, because that is what we use today. The term dialect is not used anymore that often. So, the defining the terms language and dialect has always been very difficult because of various factors, as we will soon see. So, it has been pointed out that these are ambiguous terms. Ambiguous because it is not, sometimes they might be clear. So, English and French are different languages, there is no problem there. But sometimes there are languages or there are varieties of languages which might appear similar, but they are called different languages, or sometimes the opposite also happens. They might be very different, but they are called dialects of the same language. So, we have some examples here, some of the textbook examples. So, Norfolk and Suffolk dialects actually are they are called different dialects, but there is hardly any clear linguistic break between these two. The dividing line between these two always is based on the local government. So, the point I am trying to introduce here is that what is considered a language and what is considered a dialect, for always it has always been based more on non-linguistic factors than on linguistic factors. What are those non-linguistic factors? We will eventually build up the story. And similarly, on the other hand, you can see that Dutch and German are known to be two distinct languages because they belong to two different countries, and however, the dialects spoken along the Netherlands and German border, Germany-Netherlands border are actually very similar. You can almost confuse them as same language. However, even that dialect which is very close to German, that Dutch dialect which is very close to German, they will not agree to call it similar to German. It has to be called a distinct language. So, you see both sides of the story. So, the classification of Dutch and German as distinct languages in this context is again socially and politically driven, because they are part of two different countries. Political boundary decides what is considered a language and what is considered a dialect. So, little bit of history here. How did all of these come into being? Like many other things in our intellectual history, this also goes back to a large extent to the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. Ancient Greeks had, now today when we talk about ancient Greek, we do not always mention the fact that even in ancient Greece there were many dialects, there were many varieties of the language, and each of them was important in their own way. In fact, so much so that each of the varieties had a different style of literature altogether. So, for example, I have mentioned some of them here. So, Ionic, Doric and Attic. Aeolic is also there. So, Ionic was used for writing history, Doric for choral and lyric works, and Attic for tragedy, and so on. So, ancient Greece also had a number of varieties of language, and each of them was they had their own status, own prestige and their own domain of usage, not only domain of regular usage, but also in the higher intellectual planes like writing literature, writing other kinds of literature, other kinds of treatise and all kinds of things. Eventually, of course, the Athenian Greek became the standard Greek, which later on became known as the Greek, because of the contribution of various scholars like Plato and others who wrote in that language. So, this is not a recent phenomenon, going back all the way to the ancient Greeks. The language that was powerful, language that was used by the powerful, by the most influential people, eventually gets known as the main language, and the others get into the dialect position. However, in Greece initially that was not the case. Initially each of them were important, and hence they did not mean by dialect as a variety that is less prestigious or something, because at that time they were all prestigious. However, the term dialect was borrowed from the Greek into the English language during the Renaissance period. However, with a shift in meaning, as I just said, that in the initial stages in Greece, they did not mean a less prestigious variety of a language when they call something a dialect. In French also they also use the same term, but they have a two-way distinction between these. So, they have one variety which is the regional variety, which are written and have a literature which is more close to the Greek usage of the term, because in Greek they each of these varieties were also used for writing literature. So, they were just different variations, not something to be considered a less prestigious form of the main language. Similarly, the French make another distinction, regional varieties that are not written. So, this is the variation which is closer to the English meaning of the word dialect. Anyway, so this is just to tell you that there has been a shift in meaning while taking the word from the Greek origin word. So, there is nothing absolute about the distinction made by the British. Now, so that does not help us anyway to define what is language and what is dialect, and so here comes a very famous quote by Max Weinreich: "A language is a dialect with an army and a navy." That is what that still today it stands as one of the best most precise definition of a language and a dialect, because language is spoken by a group of people who have the political and the military power to maintain their linguistic independence. That is why you will see Russian is a language, but there are many dialects in Russia which are not exactly considered, there are variations, they are kind of sidelined, as it happens in any other country. So, that is exactly what he meant. So, language is something that identifies you as a nation, as a state, or whatever the case may be, and this is more powerful. It has the political patronage, it has the literature, it has the intellectual history, and so on and so forth. Dialect on the other hand, in today's terminology, dialect on the other hand may not be so. So, that brings us to a very interesting comparison between autonomy and heteronomy. This was proposed by Turgill in 2000. So, the linguistic criteria generally are of less importance in deciding what is a language and what is a dialect. However, we have this autonomy versus heteronomy as a distinction, drawing upon what Weinreich already had said. So, languages are autonomous, they are independent, standardized variety with its own grammar, literature, prestige, and so on. So, all of these are our keywords. So, standardized, what does standardized mean? It means that it has a one certified way of writing and speaking. So, that is standardization. We will see shortly how it happens. So, this is independent. For its own prestige, for its own power, it is independent, it is standardized, it has its own grammar, literature, all of that. On the other hand, dialect can be safely called a heteronomous entity. It is dependent, non-standard, and it depends on a standard language. So, a dialect is always understood in terms of a superimposed language. So, this X variety of language A, let us say, like that. So, dialects are always a dependent kind of a thing. Here comes another important notion within this language dialect distinction, that is the idea of mutual intelligibility. Mutual intelligibility means when you understand each other or you do not. So, if the speakers of language 1 and the speakers of language 2, they do not understand each other, then they are definitely two different languages. However, if they speak slightly differently, but they still do understand each other, then they are considered dialects of the same language. So, this used to be the one of the tell signs of, or textbook definitions of how you can define, linguistically speaking, how you can define language from dialect. However, it is not always very simplistic, because whenever you have language, you have human connections and human intrigues there. So, things will never be simplified. So, mutual intelligibility, something as simple as mutual intelligibility, also has problem. For example, there are all kinds of languages which can be, we have already talked about the Dutch and German thing. So, even though they understand each other, mutual intelligibility is very high, even then you are not supposed to consider them as dialects of the same language, because of the political aspect that is attached to it. Similarly, border areas often maintain a dialect continuum. So, it is not, the languages never are too distinct from one another suddenly. it is always a continuum. So, from on the one hand if you have Dutch and on the other hand if you have German, there are in between stages where there will be slowly that will change into one dialect to another and then eventually it becomes German. So, it is very difficult to have a clear cut distinction and a watertight compartmentalization. Sometimes even without a dialect continuum, some distinct languages are mutually intelligible. Now, there is this entire debate about the Hindi Urdu differentiation, whether they are different languages or they are just at what level are the differences to be attested and what level they are not. As a linguist, from linguistic perspective, they are actually more or less the same language. However, there are some very important distinctions between them. For example, the script. So, Hindi is written in Devanagari script from left to right, Urdu is written in Arabic Persian script from right to left. There are some lexical differences, but by and large overall they are more or less the same language. However, not everybody agrees on this. Fourth, some dialects are not mutually intelligible, but are considered to be one language, the same language, dialects of the same language. For example, the case of China. So, Mandarin and Cantonese are they share a writing system, but they are not mutually intelligible in spoken discourse. So, they are very different from one another. However, they are still considered dialects of the same Chinese language. So, here also the political socio-political cultural aspect plays a bigger role than the linguistic aspect. So, this is why it is not a very easy thing to define what is a language and what is a dialect. Now, there are other ways of looking at it also. So, size is one, for example, size as in the abstract notion of size as well as the number of speakers. So, a language is larger than a dialect always. So, for example, English as a language contains the sum total of all the terms in all its dialects. So, let us say dialect 1 of English has a vocabulary of 2 lakhs or let us say 50,000, 60,000 or whatever, another dialect has a little bit more. Now, English language will be including all of those vocabulary. So, each dialect may have a little less, but the language on its own right will have a larger vocabulary. So, that is what we mean by larger. Also, when you say speakers of English language, you include all of these dialect speakers as well. So, that from that perspective also language is larger than a dialect. And standard English is one of the dialects. So, one of the varieties will be standardized, will be taken as the official representation of that language, that is called the standard language. Prestige, another factor. So, language has prestige which dialects do not. So, typically they do not until and unless it is the standard dialect, that is a different story. So, a standard dialect in this case is a language by virtue of the prestige accorded to it, and this prestige also happens because of the seat of power. So, if the variety that is spoken where the seat of power is will automatically become the official language, the standard language, the main language or whatever you call it. So, Hindi that we know today, which is Hindi, the official Hindi that is spoken today is the Hindi that is spoken around Delhi. There was a time when that was not the case, the Hindi in Delhi was not at all the standard variety. So, depending on how political power play changes, language status of language also changes. So, what is a dialect today can become a language tomorrow, what is a language today can become a dialect tomorrow. So, these are the other factors that are that might be taken into account while deciding what is a language and what is a dialect. So, as a result, on the identification of a speech form as a dialect or a variation largely is based on two different kinds of criteria. Of course, the linguistic criteria which is mutual intelligibility that we just talked about, and then there is also a measurable similarity in lexis and grammar. So, there has to be some amount of similarity between the lexicon, the words and the grammar. Otherwise, if everything is very different, then of course, you are speaking two different languages. So, that is from the linguistic perspective, these are the criteria. Non-linguistic of course, are political, geographical or racial identity and the historical identity, historicity of a language, how it has been, that also plays a very important role. Now, so the challenge in defining language, of course, then are because of all of these factors. So, we try to typically we try to group various communication systems under one level, language, but because of all of these complexities that I have just mentioned, there has been different kinds of takes on this. For example, Bell talks about recognizing different kinds of languages. So, you do not need to just talk about language as a monolith. You can actually have based on various factors, social, linguistic, cultural, political and all that, and then you can have different kinds of terminologies. So, on the basis of that we talk about standardization, vitality, historicity, autonomy, reduction, mixture and de facto norms. All of these can be also used as terms to refer to certain kinds of communication system that has been proposed. So, that is why we have all of these different kinds of names and tags for languages. Some of them are more commonly used than others. For example, majority versus minority language, standard versus non-standard language, classical language. In Indian context, we have we are very familiar with the classical language, modern Indian language, scheduled language versus non-scheduled language versus dialect. All of these different kinds of tags and names have been used for identifying the varieties that are spoken based on a number of factors that we just talked about. So, in Indian case, classical language are those languages that have a rather long history of heritage, cultural heritage and so on. So, let us now look at some of these terms that we have talked about. Let us just unpack them a little bit. So, standard language is in fact one of the varieties of a particular language that has been accepted as the most proper version, that is the face of the language, let us say. So, the standard Hindi is the Hindi that represents all the Hindis kind of, or a standard of any other language. So, there are a number of processes that a typical standard language passes through, which is called standardization process. So, definition will be a variety used by a group of people in their public discourse. Alternatively, a standard variety has undergone a process of standardization by which it is organized for description in grammar, dictionaries and encoded in such reference works. So, these are the textbook definitions of what a standard language is. So, there are two ways in which one can arrive at a standard language. One is one variety of a language is picked up for various reasons which has nothing to do with linguistic factors. They might be picked up and considered a standard language, that is one. Another is the sometimes they might be it might be considered that let us give this language a new status, let us make this a standard language, and thereby we have to you cannot just. So, if a language has not been a language of administration, not a language for education, not a language for judiciary, and then overnight the political powers decide that this language can be given some new status, then it goes through a process of standardization. So, both cases you arrive finally you arrive at a standard language. So, standardization is a rather lengthy and a very tedious process. How does it happen? First you starts with selection. So, one particular variety is selected to be the one to be developed into the standard language. So, this is the important factor here. First and foremost, if it is not already a powerful language for a long time, you select one language. How does the selection happen? It does not happen in a random fashion, there is always a pattern to it. So, often this is the variety used in the various political or commercial centers. So, for example, if you have in India we have states carved out on linguistic basis. So, a new state comes in and then you have to give a new language as its standard language. So, in that case, let us say you decide that state X has been carved out, now we need to create a standard language for this. So, you pick up one language that represents the majority of people in that state, and then you and also from where the most political or commercial centers are also positioned, then you choose that language. That is how selection happens. After that, the most tedious part happens, which is codification. So, often this is more important when the language that we are picking or selecting does not have a long history of written records or long history of literature or cultural artifacts or something like this. If it is there, not a problem. If it is not there, then you need to codify those information. So, for suddenly if a language has to be used for education purposes, then we need to create the terminologies that are relevant for that domain of use. Similarly, for administration, for judiciary, for a number of different kinds of domains of usage. So, codification is a process which is scientific, and there is a method through which the lexicon are created. Various kinds of standardization, other process also happens. All of this is called the process of codification. So, writing down the grammar, dictionary, etc., in order to give the correct form of the language to its people, because once it is standardized, you cannot play with it. So, that one has to decide what the words that will go into the final version, what kind of structures will be kept and what will be not, what will be left out. All of that are part of codification process. Then the elaboration of function. Standard variety is to be used for all official purposes, hence sometimes it is needed to incorporate extra linguistic items. So, all kinds of new terms might be coined. For example, even when a language is used for official purposes, let us say Hindi, and now you have the technological advances. To keep up with the technological advances, a language needs to incorporate those new words. So, initially we use computer for all, in all languages we use computer, but then there are new words that are also coming in. So, Hindi has, if I am not mistaken, it is called Sanganak something. So, there are those things. So, this is called incorporating new extra linguistic items into the existing lexicon, because for the various reasons of elaboration of functions. Technology is one domain of function. Then the last part is acceptance. The chosen variety then needs to be accepted by the relevant population as the standard representation of their language. So, this is what is important, and identity, once that happens, this works as a strong unifying factor. So, that is what standardization is as a process is. And then the consequence of this, of course, there are every action has its reactions. So, consequence is, of course, the language that gets through this process becomes a powerful language. It unifies its people, it represents its people, becomes an identity marker, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, there are certain ideological differences that might arise, because when one variety is chosen to be representative, the other varieties get sidelined. That is inevitable, and it happens, and this sometimes has a fallout which is not very nice. Now, there is this idea that because when you are standardizing one variety, of course, standardizing is a pragmatic step for carrying out various kinds of administrative and other official works. But some people, some varieties that did not get the opportunity might feel neglected, and this creates an ideological rift, and this has been called, this ideological system is referred as standard language ideology. So, this is and I quote, a bias toward an abstract idealized language which is imposed and maintained by dominant institutions, and which has as its model the written language, but which is drawn primarily from the spoken language of the upper middle class. So, you can complain that this is one variety has been chosen at the cost of the others. So, that is one common complaint against this process. Now, dialects, so we have, so on the one hand we have language which is standardized through this kind of processes, on the other hand we have dialect. So, the older version, older terms used were non-standard, corrupt, non-sophisticated form of a standard language, and these are the kind of definitions that we had. A dialect is a distinct form of a language generally associated with a recognizable regional, social and ethnic group, differentiated from the other forms of the language by specific linguistic features. So, basically when a variety exists that is different from the standard variety based on various factors like region, like social class or ethnic group, networks and so on and so forth. This is how it used to be defined. But in reality, variation in language is so pervasive that each language is actually a continuum of languages from speaker to speaker, from group to group and so on. So, it is not actually a very simple idea, that is what we are trying to arrive at. Now, some other important factors that are also part of this entire discussion about language and dialect debate. So, vitality is one such question. Vitality basically refers to how the health of the language. So, does it have a thriving community of speakers or it does not have, that is often an important marker, because language, when you call it a language, it typically has, but variations or dialects, because there are sometimes a very small group of people, they may or may not have a very healthy population of speakers. So, that is why vitality is a question. For example, there are some languages that I have added here. So, Manx died after Second World War. Languages are dying every day as we speak. So, this is a very common thing. Cornish, for example, last speaker Dorothy died in 1777. Many aboriginal languages of the Americas were killed during the colonization period. Latin has disappeared from the public discourse, it is preserved only in the literary or liturgical form and so on and so forth. So, languages over a period of time, languages change, their vitality changes, and also sometimes they remain restricted to certain functions and they largely disappear from the public discourse. Some languages have been revived and then used as a some sort of an identity marker and so on. So, classical Greek is considered dead language by many. So, classical Greek and Latin, even though they are not used much, they still influence the Western languages. Historicity on the other hand is another important factor. Historicity as in a sense of identity because of the historical aspects that are connected to this language. So, how did this come about? What is the background to this use? So, languages are often the strongest unifying tie, stronger than social, political, religious and other kinds of ties. So, you can see all these examples here. German was used as a language to unify the country in the 19th century. Russian revitalized as a unifying force in the last century. Arabic again unifies a vast number of countries, diverse countries on the basis of the shared language. Chinese, Hebrew, again Hebrew was revitalized as a unifying force for the persecuted people, threatened people and so on. So, historicity is another important factor. So, Hebrew was considered a dead language, now it is a thriving language. So, it is a language because it stands for an identity, something of that sort is important to include in the discussion on the language dialect debate. Then comes our autonomy. Language is considered a distinct when its speakers feel it is different from the others. It is subjects, this is a subjective criterion based on speaker perception rather than purely linguistic evidence. So, there are all these kinds of different kinds of debates. For example, Russian and Ukrainians view their language as separate and they resisted Russification, even though there are some similarities, but because of the identity factor, the autonomy factor, there is a resistance. Similarly, African American vernacular English, or it is also called Ebonics. So, the African American English is slightly different and often it is used as an identity marker. So, because of the again the same factor of autonomy. So, they do not want, so the difference is maintained even through their songs and other cultural practices, so that an independent autonomous identity remains intact. So, that is how language also is used. Reduction is another feature here that is also important. So, this is a variety because it is seen as a sub variety rather than a full independent language. So, because of that there is a reduction in their function, reduction in their prestige and so on. So, the speech is not representative of the full language. So, for example, Cockney is a variety of English, not a separate language, because sometimes they might lack a written variety, a written system and so on. So, pidgins are another form of language that is also considered severely reduced and so on. Mixture, of course, we will talk about these things eventually later also as separate categories. So, sometimes languages are mixed based on various kinds of historical factors. So, we create mixed varieties of language, and those mixtures will typically the pidgins and creoles, they are often called mixed or impure or substandard varieties of languages. De facto norms are another, this is another domain. So, this refers to belief in the proper usage and good versus poor speakers. So, if you are a good speaker of a language, then you are speaking a proper language. If you are not, then you are speaking a dialect, all these kinds of things. So, a variety, particular variety may be seen as the standard, like the Parisian French, the Florentine Italian and so on and so forth. So, they become the de facto norms, they are the representative varieties. So, standards must not only exist, but must be observed. So, it is not like just a textbook sort of a thing, it must be observed. So, these are the nuances that need to be mentioned when we have any discussion on language versus dialect. So, as a matter of fact, this is standard language, language and dialect, these are mere tags from a linguistics perspective. These are just tags mostly based on non-linguistic factors. The only difference among them is the matter of prestige and power. So, as a result of this, we now call all of them rather than calling them dialects, we call them variations, because dialects has this old world tag of being less prestigious, less standard and so on and so forth. So, what are varieties? We call them variations. So, there are what used to be called dialects, now we call them varieties. So, varieties are language varieties, they are mutually intelligible, but they have some difference. So, what are those differences? These are the domains within which the differences are measured. So, phonetic, lexical, grammatical and pragmatic differences might be there. Phonetic differences as in the same sound being pronounced differently or slightly different rules of phonology, for example. So, in India also you can see the sa, sha distinction, the ja, za distinction, kha, kha distinction and so on and so forth in Hindi itself. Similarly, many other languages. So, morphological variation is also there. For example, in case of northern England and southern Wales, where the s suffix is used as a general present tense marker. In many other dialects of English, s is reserved for marking the present tense in third person singular form only. So, something as taken for granted as the s third person singular marker is. So, I like, he likes to walk, he walks every day, something like that. Even that is not something that is universally present in all varieties of English. So, it is possible in certain varieties. So, to say I likes him, we walks all the time, it is all possible. Similarly, the case of ne marker in Hindi. Syntactic variations are also there. For example, the double negatives are a significant marker of a different variety in both Indian languages as well as American. So, African American languages have double negatives. In Hindi, in case of Indian languages, Hindi, a particular variety of Hindi uses double negative and so on. So, this is one, and then lexical and semantic variations are also there. So, for example, this is all of these are common distinctions between the British and the American English. So, the same thing is called differently in the two languages. However, they are not completely different languages. So, the point that we are trying to get at here is the varieties or variations that we talk about, there might be variation on the basis of these things. So, for the sound system, morphological system, some amount of syntactic variation, some amount of lexical and semantic variation, these are the differences that might exist between those variations. However, on the bigger picture is that they are part of the same language. So, we will carry on with this nuanced understanding of language and variations in the next lecture also. For lecture 1, this is where we end. Thank you.